When President Trump announced that the United States would run Venezuela after capturing its president, legal experts around the world recognized they were witnessing something unprecedented: the systematic dismantling of the international legal framework that has governed state behavior since World War II. But what many missed was that this wasn't just about one military operation in Latin America. It was the formal launch of a new era where might makes right, and the world's most powerful nations are now openly abandoning the pretense of multilateral cooperation. The images of Nicolas Maduro in handcuffs aboard a U.S. military vessel represent more than just a successful special operations mission. They represent the moment when the United States formally announced its withdrawal from the post-1945 international order. According to multiple reports from international law scholars, the Venezuela operation crosses red lines that have been respected by every American administration since the founding of the United Nations. This wasn't a peacekeeping mission authorized by the Security Council. It wasn't a humanitarian intervention with international support. It was unilateral regime change conducted without legal justification and celebrated as a demonstration of American power. To understand why this matters, you have to look beyond the specifics of the Maduro regime. Yes, he was widely considered illegitimate. Yes, his government was linked to drug trafficking and human rights abuses. But the international legal system wasn't designed to make exceptions for unpopular leaders. It was designed to prevent exactly what happened in Venezuela, a powerful nation deciding unilaterally that another country's government needed to be removed and acting on that decision with military force. The response from the international community has been telling in its muted nature. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, there was global outrage and massive protests. The action was widely condemned as illegal under international law, even by close allies. But the response to Venezuela has been fundamentally different. European leaders have offered carefully worded statements about respecting international law, while simultaneously acknowledging that Maduro's removal might benefit Venezuelan democracy. This lukewarm response isn't just diplomatic caution, it's recognition that the rules of the game have fundamentally changed. According to sources familiar with classified diplomatic communications, governments around the world are conducting urgent reassessments of their own security assumptions. If the United States is willing to abandon international legal constraints when it serves its interests, what's to stop other major powers from doing the same? The Venezuela precedent has effectively given every regional hegemon permission to act unilaterally in its sphere of influence. This shift has been years in the making, but the Venezuela operation represents its full crystallization. Trump's 2025 national security strategy explicitly rejected what it called permanent American domination of the entire world in favor of regional spheres of influence. The document frames international relations as fundamentally governed by power rather than law, describing the outsized influence of larger, richer, and stronger nations as a timeless truth. This isn't just a policy preference. It's a philosophical rejection of the multilateral system that has governed international relations for decades. The legal justification offered by the Trump administration reveals just how far we've moved from established norms. Attorney General Pam Bondi cited drug trafficking charges as the basis for the operation, but these charges were filed in U.S. courts under U.S. law. There was no international warrant, no request for extradition, and no involvement from international law enforcement agencies. The message is clear: American law now applies wherever American power can reach. International legal experts have been remarkably candid in their assessments. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a professor of international law at the Hague Academy, told colleagues in a private briefing that the Venezuela operation represents the single most significant challenge to the Westphalian system since the end of World War II. The Westphalian system, established in 1648, is built on the principle of sovereignty, the idea that states have the right to govern their own territory without external interference. The U.S. operation in Venezuela doesn't just violate this principle, it explicitly rejects it as outdated. The implications extend far beyond Latin America. According to intelligence assessments cited in regional media, Chinese military planners have accelerated their timeline for potential action in the South China Sea. Russian strategists are reportedly reassessing their options in Eastern Europe. Iranian leaders are calculating whether the Venezuela precedent gives them cover for more aggressive action against regional rivals. The common thread is that all of these governments now operate under the assumption that international law provides no meaningful constraint on the behavior of major powers. This represents a fundamental return to 19th century balance of power politics, but with 21st century military capabilities. The difference is profound. When European powers carved up spheres of influence in the 1800s, they lacked the technology to project power globally or to threaten the existence of entire civilizations. Today's major powers possess weapons that can end modern life as we know it, operated by leaders who are increasingly convinced that international law is a luxury they can no longer afford. The economic implications of this shift are already becoming apparent. International markets rely on predictable legal frameworks and dispute resolution mechanisms. When major powers begin acting unilaterally, it introduces systemic uncertainty that makes long-term investment and planning extremely difficult. The Venezuela operation has sent shockwaves through global energy markets, not just because of the oil reserves involved, but because it demonstrates that resource-rich countries can be subject to forcible regime change if they align with the wrong great power. Perhaps most troubling is how this shift is being received by publics around the world. In China, social media platforms have exploded with commentary praising the efficiency of the U.S. operation and calling for Beijing to adopt similar tactics. In Russia, state media has framed the Venezuela intervention as validation of Moscow's own approach to Ukraine. Authoritarian governments everywhere are pointing to Venezuela as proof that the liberal international order was always a fiction designed to constrain rising powers while protecting Western hegemony. This narrative is finding resonance even in democratic countries. European populist movements have seized on the Venezuela operation as evidence that international law only applies to weak nations. They argue that if the United States can act unilaterally when its interests are threatened, why should European countries constrain themselves with multilateral agreements and international institutions? This erosion of public support for international legal frameworks may prove to be the most lasting consequence of the Venezuela operation. The timing of this shift could not be more dangerous. The world faces unprecedented global challenges that require coordinated international responses: climate change, pandemic preparedness, nuclear proliferation, and economic inequality. These challenges cannot be addressed by individual nations acting alone, no matter how powerful. They require the kind of sustained multilateral cooperation that becomes impossible when the major powers view each other as existential threats rather than potential partners. The institutional infrastructure built to support international cooperation is already showing signs of strain. According to sources familiar with internal UN deliberations, several major powers are reassessing their commitment to international organizations. The Security Council has become increasingly paralyzed as permanent members abandon the pretense of working within established procedures. International courts are losing their ability to enforce decisions when major powers simply ignore their rulings. What's emerging in place of the post-1945 order looks remarkably similar to what existed before it: a world divided into competing spheres of influence, where smaller nations survive by choosing the right patron and where disputes between major powers are settled through demonstrations of force rather than negotiations within institutional frameworks. The Venezuela operation isn't the cause of this transformation, it's the announcement that the transformation is complete. The human cost of this shift will be enormous. International law, for all its imperfections, provided some protection for vulnerable populations and smaller nations. It created mechanisms for peaceful dispute resolution and established principles that even powerful countries felt obligated to respect, at least publicly. When those constraints disappear, the result is inevitably more conflict, more suffering, and more instability. We're already seeing this play out in real time. According to humanitarian organizations, the collapse of international legal constraints has coincided with a dramatic increase in civilian casualties in conflict zones around the world. When major powers no longer feel bound by international humanitarian law, they have little incentive to minimize collateral damage or protect non-combatants. The Venezuela precedent legitimizes this approach and makes it far more likely that future conflicts will be conducted without regard for civilian protection. The economic integration that has characterized the global economy for decades also becomes unsustainable in a world where major powers view each other as adversaries rather than competitors within a shared system. Supply chains that span multiple continents become vulnerabilities when those continents are controlled by hostile powers. Trade agreements become meaningless when the parties no longer share basic assumptions about how disputes should be resolved. Looking ahead, the challenge for American foreign policy is managing the consequences of a world order that it has helped to create but may no longer be able to control. By abandoning international legal constraints, the United States has given every other major power permission to do the same. But America's geographic position, economic structure, and alliance relationships were all designed for a world where international law provided some predictability and constraint on the behavior of competitors. In a world of pure power competition, the United States faces challenges that its current political system may not be equipped to handle. Democratic societies are notoriously bad at sustained geopolitical competition because democratic publics eventually tire of the costs and demand a return to normal life. Authoritarian systems, by contrast, can sustain competition indefinitely because they don't face the same domestic political constraints. The Venezuela operation may have demonstrated American military superiority, but it also revealed the fundamental weakness of a strategy based purely on force. Military power can remove governments, but it cannot create legitimate institutions or win the loyalty of populations. The United States now finds itself responsible for running a country of 28 million people with a collapsed economy, a degraded infrastructure, and a population that has every reason to resent foreign occupation, regardless of how brutal their previous government was. This is the paradox of abandoning international law in favor of unilateral action. Short-term tactical successes become long-term strategic liabilities because they create obligations that democratic societies are unwilling to sustain and resistance movements that grow stronger over time. The United States discovered this in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the lesson seems to have been forgotten in the rush to demonstrate resolve in Venezuela. Perhaps most concerning is how this shift affects America's ability to build the coalitions necessary to address genuine threats to international security. When the United States acted within international legal frameworks, it could count on support from allies and partners who shared basic assumptions about how the international system should function. When it acts unilaterally, it forces those same allies to choose between their commitment to international law and their security relationship with America. Most will choose America, at least in the short term, but they will do so reluctantly and with reservations that limit the effectiveness of any coalition. The lukewarm European response to the Venezuela operation is a preview of what American leaders can expect in future crises. Allies will go along with American decisions, but they will not enthusiastically endorse them or contribute significantly to their implementation. The irony is that by abandoning the international legal framework, the United States has made itself more isolated and less secure, not stronger. International law was always primarily a tool for managing American hegemony, rather than constraining it. The system gave smaller countries a voice while ensuring that American interests were generally protected. By destroying that system, America has forced every other country to choose sides in a way that makes compromise and accommodation far more difficult. The world is now entering a period of pure geopolitical competition where the stakes are existential and the constraints are minimal. The Venezuela operation didn't create this dynamic, but it made it irreversible. Whether this leads to a new form of stability based on clearly defined spheres of influence or to escalating conflict between major powers remains to be seen. What's certain is that the international legal framework that has governed state behavior for the past 75 years is now effectively dead. The question facing policymakers around the world is what comes next. Some hope that a new set of agreements can be negotiated between the major powers that will provide some predictability and constraint on their behavior. Others believe that we are entering a period of sustained competition that will only end when one power achieves clear dominance over all others. The Venezuela operation suggests that American leaders have chosen the latter path, with all the risks that it entails. For ordinary citizens watching these developments, the implications are profound. The international system that has provided relative peace and prosperity for most of the world since 1945 is being replaced by something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The rules that once constrained the behavior of powerful nations have been abandoned in favor of a return to the law of the jungle. How long this transformation takes and how much damage it causes along the way may be the defining questions of the next decade.